The sun had only begun to rise when the first whisper of trouble touched the far edges of the Cimarron Plains, a shimmer of heat rolling over the horizon like the breath of some giant creature waking from a centuries-long sleep, and John Calder, rancher, widower, and the kind of man whose silence spoke louder than a sermon, felt the shift in the air long before he saw the smoke, as though the earth itself was warning him that this day would carve its mark into his life. He was riding the perimeter of his pasture, checking the fence lines, when the wind brought the scent of burning cedar, sharp and unfamiliar, nothing like the cook fires of settlers nor the sweet smoke signals used by neighboring tribes, and as his horse, Bramble, tossed its dark head uneasily, John tightened the reins and scanned the distant hills, where faint plumes rose like ghostly fingers signaling danger. Yet it was not the smoke that made him change direction but the sudden echo of gunfire carried thin and brittle across the desert. One shot, then another, then the unmistakable sound of someone crying out in a voice raw with desperation. Without thinking, John kicked Bramble into a gallop, the ground racing beneath them in a blur of ochre dust and sun-bleached stones, his heartbeat matching the pounding of hooves as he approached a narrow ravine he rarely visited, and there, in the choke point between two jagged cliffs, he saw a scene that froze him momentarily. A wagon, its wheels shattered, supplies spilling onto the dirt, surrounded by three armed men whose ragged clothes marked them as outlaws drifting too long on the wrong side of hunger and conscience, and at the center of the chaos, clutching a makeshift spear with trembling, blood-streaked hands, stood a young Apache girl, barely 16 by the look of her, her dark braid loosened and her eyes burning with a mix of fear and fierce defiance as she braced herself between the outlaws and an elderly man pinned beneath the broken wagon. John didn't have time to consider the politics of stepping into a fight that wasn't his, didn't pause to wonder whether rescuing an Apache girl would start more fires than the one already burning behind those hills. He simply reacted, drawing his rifle, firing a warning shot that ricocheted off the canyon wall like thunder, startling the men who spun toward him with curses on their lips. But John was already charging forward, shouting for them to back away as Bramble surged between the outlaws and the girl, dust exploding around them. The confrontation was swift, chaotic, filled with the sharp clatter of boots and the sting of adrenaline. One outlaw lunged at John, only to be knocked aside by the horse's shoulder. Another tried to drag the girl by the arm before she jabbed him in the thigh with the broken spear, allowing John the moment he needed to disarm him with a blow from his rifle stock. And by the time the last outlaw scrambled up the ravine wall and fled into the desert, the canyon had fallen into a tense silence broken only by the girl's ragged breathing and the distant crackle of flames. John dismounted slowly, hands open to show he meant no harm, and the girl, still trembling, kept the makeshift spear pointed at him, her jaw clenched hard enough to turn her lips white, and for a long moment they stared at one another, two people from worlds that mistrusted each other deeply, both weary, both bruised, both aware that the desert did not often give second chances, until the elderly man beneath the wagon groaned softly and the girl's composure broke, her weapon clattering to the ground as she rushed to his side, speaking softly in her language. John knelt to help lift the broken wheel, and though she flinched at his proximity, she didn't stop him, watching with wary eyes as he freed the man whose leg had been crushed and whose breaths were growing shallow. John knew immediately the old man wouldn't last long without medical help, but the nearest settlement was half a day's ride, and his ranch only an hour away. He offered to take them both there, to safety, to water, to shelter, but the girl stiffened, suspicion returning, and she said nothing, only looked at him with a hesitation shaped by generations of betrayal. Still, when the old man's fingers weakly grasped her wrist and he muttered a word, one that John didn't understand but felt was heavy with meaning, she nodded reluctantly, allowing John to lift the elder onto his horse while she walked beside them, her shoulders tight, her gaze never leaving him. The journey back to the ranch was quiet, tense, marked by the distant rumble of the fire spreading somewhere beyond the ridge, and when at last they reached the wooden homestead tucked between cottonwoods and wind-scarred earth, John helped settle the old man inside, offering blankets and water while the girl hovered near the doorway like a wild creature trapped between flight and necessity, and though she refused food and spoke only in short, guarded phrases, he noticed the way her eyes softened when she realized he was not trying to separate her from the elder, nor question her presence, nor bind her to some obligation. Night fell heavy, carrying with it a cold that seeped into every crack of the ranch house, and as the oil lamp flickered over the sleeping elder's face, the girl finally sank onto the floor beside him, exhaustion dragging her eyelids low, and John, still unsure why he had involved himself in something that might bring trouble, stood at the doorway watching over them, unaware that this single day, this single choice made in a canyon of smoke and desperation, was the first step toward a bond he had never expected and a future that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loyalty, identity, and the fragile threads that tie strangers together in the harsh corners of the world. And as he stepped onto the porch, staring out at the moonlit plains where distant embers still glowed on the horizon, he wondered who exactly he had brought into his home, and why he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had just changed direction, pulling him into a story far larger than a simple rescue. The morning after the rescue began with an uneasy quiet, the kind that settles over a place before everyone inside it decides whether they are safe or simply pretending to be, and John Calder woke before dawn as he always did, habit driving him out of bed with the first pale light streaking across the plains, but this time, as he stepped into the main room, he halted at the sight before him. The Apache girl, still unnamed to him, sat rigidly beside the sleeping elder, her slender frame wrapped in one of his wool blankets, her eyes open and alert despite the fatigue etched into her face, as though she had not rested at all, and when she caught him watching her, she stiffened further, clutching the elder's hand protectively. John lifted his palm slightly, the universal sign of peace that was starting to feel like his new morning ritual, and he moved quietly to the stove to set a kettle to boil, letting the warm aroma of coffee and the crackling fire soften the tension in the room, though the girl's wary gaze never left him. When the old man stirred with a low groan, his eyes fluttering open in confusion before settling with recognition on the girl, she leaned in close, speaking to him in a stream of soft syllables that John couldn't understand, yet the tenderness in her voice told him more than words ever could, and as the elder's hand reached out shakily to accept a cup of water John offered, the girl's expression shifted, something between reluctant gratitude and continued suspicion, as though she was struggling to reconcile the idea that a white rancher could show kindness without demanding something in return. After a few attempts at gestures and broken bits of English, John finally learned the girl's name was Ayanna, which rolled over his tongue with a weight he didn't expect, carrying a quiet strength that matched the fire he saw in her eyes, and when he asked about the elder, she hesitated before muttering a name, Taza, her grandfather, before falling silent again, her gaze drifting toward the open window where smoke from the distant hills still smudged the horizon like a bruise across the sky. John knew that whatever trouble had found them in the ravine had not ended there, and as Ayanna's eyes tightened with worry, he suspected she knew it too, though he waited, giving her space, for he sensed she was a girl accustomed to danger, yet not accustomed to trusting anyone outside her own people. While Taza slept again, John stepped outside to resume his chores, his hands moving through familiar motions, feeding the horses, checking the tack, inspecting the fence line, but his attention kept drifting back to the house, to the memory of Ayanna's guarded stare, to the heavy silence that seemed to grow every time she caught sight of him, as though she believed each kindness hid an ulterior motive no one had yet revealed. When he returned inside mid-morning with a basin of clean water, he found Ayanna attempting to lift Taza, her small frame shaking with the effort, and before she could protest, John moved to help, easing the old man into a sitting position while she watched sharply, ready to intervene if he so much as breathed wrong, and he realized then that this girl, fierce and stubborn as desert ironwood, had probably been fighting the world alone far longer than anyone her age should have. After settling Taza and preparing a weak broth, John sat across the room, giving the pair space, and tried to ask, gently, what had happened to them, but Ayanna pressed her lips into a thin line, refusing to speak, her fingers tightening protectively around the elder's blanket until her knuckles whitened, and it wasn't until Taza himself rasped a few words, followed by a gesture toward the horizon, that fragments of the truth emerged. Their small traveling band had been attacked not by rival tribes but by a group of desperate outlaws known to raid isolated camps, and though they had tried to flee, only Taza and Ayanna had escaped, wounded, frightened, and alone. John listened, jaw tightening, fury simmering beneath the calm mask he wore, because he knew the kind of men who would prey on a weakened elder and a young girl, men who believed violence gave them ownership of anything they desired, and as he stared at Ayanna, he felt a protective instincts he didn't fully understand sharpen inside him, though he masked it behind quiet nods. Throughout the afternoon, despite the tension, a subtle shift occurred between them. Ayanna accepted water from his hands instead of snatching it away. She let him check Taza's fever, and once, when she thought he wasn't looking, she watched him with an expression that wasn't anger or suspicion but something closer to weary curiosity, as though she was trying to understand a world that had never been kind to her before. When evening came and a cold wind swept across the plains, rattling the shutters, John set an extra log in the fire, not for himself but for the two figures huddled near it, and as Taza slept more peacefully, Ayanna finally allowed exhaustion to overtake her, her chin dipping to her chest as sleep pulled her in. John gently draped another blanket around her shoulders, stepping carefully so as not to wake her, and he paused in the doorway, looking back at the girl who had stormed into his life with the force of a desert wildfire, unexpected, dangerous, impossible to ignore, and he wondered what destiny had in mind now that the delicate balance between them had begun to shift. Outside, the stars gathered like 1,000 watching eyes, and a coyote's distant howl echoed across the plains, a reminder that the world was full of unseen threats. Yet for the first time in many years, John felt his ranch was no longer just a place of lonely routine but a fragile sanctuary holding 3 lives bound together by circumstance, danger, and the mysterious threads of fate neither he nor Ayanna yet understood. And as he stood beneath the vast sweep of night sky, John Calder, who had never asked for companionship or entanglements, felt the stirrings of a story that was only beginning, one that would test loyalties, bridge worlds divided by history, and challenge him to protect not only his home but the strange, fierce girl who had entered it, perhaps not by choice but by something deeper, something that whispered their paths were never meant to remain separate.